The most significant question facing all of mankind is that of the existence of God. Thus, the Bible chairs, located on the campuses of North Texas State University and Texas Woman's University, under the oversight of the University Church of Christ, promoted the Warren-Flew debate. Because of the importance of this question, it was necessary to invite the two most capable men available who had attained the doctorate degree in the field of philosophy to debate this issue. Dr. Thomas B. Warren of the Harding Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee, was selected to defend the existence of God. Dr. A.G.N. Flew of the University of Reading in Reading, England, was selected to defend the atheistic position. Dr. Flew is recognized as one of the leading philosophers of the world holding to the atheistic position. We welcome you to the third session of the Warren-Flew debate. Does God exist? Dr. Warren affirms, "I know that God does exist."
Dr. Flew, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that it is a real pleasure for me to stand before you this evening in affirmation of the proposition which has been read in your hearing. I know that God does exist. I have a very definite obligation to that proposition to set out an argument, to set out, in fact, a valid argument, one which has true premises, which constitutes a sound argument and therefore will constitute proof of that proposition. But first, just a few introductory words. It has been suggested that perhaps in a point or two I might have been unphilosophical, and since this is basically a contention between two philosophers, I just want to make clear that being philosophical does not mean that one does not have to sound as if he really means it, and it does not mean that he does not recognize and honor the law of rationality. In fact, a very high percentage of philosophers would hold that recognizing and honoring the law of rationality is indeed a mark of a philosopher. I make no apologies whatever for being both a philosopher and a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I have wondered, why has Dr. Flew failed in his responsibility as an affirmative speaker? That is, to present a sound argument for his contention in a precise, logical way. It has been suggested perhaps because he is in a foreign country, but I can see that that could have little or nothing to do with this proposition. That because he's out of his own country will have nothing to do with how he handles intellectual material, or because he's not accustomed to this style of debating. I have heard him in discussions before, and he seemed not to be bothered at all by the kind of style or format that was involved. Or perhaps that he didn't know the responsibility of an affirmative speaker. But that cannot be so, because in his writings he constantly chides a man who does not recognize his responsibility as an affirmant. Or because he does not know the arguments, and I deny that emphatically. In reading the works of Dr. Flew, I am convinced that he knows the arguments that are involved as well as anybody in the world. Or because he does not understand or accept the law of rationality. The truth of the matter is, he's written very strongly and frequently in defense of it. But he has not, of course, acted in harmony with it in this discussion. In the affirmative, when he is in the affirmative, writing, and he writes constantly almost of matters that are concerned with God or very closely related to God, at least subjects that are peripheral to the subject of God. In fact, it is the case that he is almost God intoxicated. He constantly emphasizes in his books that the onus of proof is on the affirmative writer or speaker. But I am afraid that he has not recognized that in this discussion. I want you to note carefully that I am not attacking Dr. Flew as a person at all. If there is anything in this world that I knew to do to help him, I assure you that I would be glad to do it lovingly and with compassion. But I make no excuse for attacking his doctrine. That's what I came here to do. And he came here to attack the doctrine which I am teaching. That is our purpose in this discussion. But each of us has a responsibility to the proposition which we are affirming. I have a suggestion perhaps that might explain it, that perhaps for the first time in his life, the real burden of proof for showing proof that God does not exist has been on his shoulders. that he was not in the role of simply sitting back and saying to the theist, now the burden of proof is on your shoulders, you have not convinced me yet. But he has had that responsibility, and it seems clear to me, and I say it as kindly as I know how to say it, that he has failed to do it. But his failure is due not to the man, but to the doctrine. There are no men in this nation, there are no men in his own native country who can prove the proposition which he set himself out to prove. And to devastate a doctrine is not to devastate a man. I want you to notice further, by way of introductory remarks, that it seems hard for my learned colleague to decide whether he wants to be an atheist or an agnostic. In his debate with Dr. Plantinga in California, which I heard and enjoyed a great deal, he made clear that there was something of a disdain in his mind for an agnostic, indicating that they seemed to be willing to, if they were with theists, to lean in that direction, or if they were with atheists, to lean in that direction. And he pleaded for the audience to come out clearly and strongly for atheism. But in this discussion, he seems to want to be merely one who says, I am just not a theist, and has therefore not really presented the argument that would show that God does not exist. It seems further to be hard for him to decide whether he wants to remain a rationalist in the sense in which one who honors, recognizes, and abides by the law of rationality, or to become an existential philosopher. That is, one that would involve a leap into the dark. I wonder, Dr. Flood, do you wish to decide to become an existentialist atheist so that those who you would propose to be, those who would join with you in this particular philosophical endeavor, will make that decision not upon the basis of a rational presentation, but simply a leap into the dark? Now, surely Dr. Flood will not want to stay with that. He will want to straighten up what has already gone on in this discussion that would indicate he's gone in that direction. There is one point which Dr. Flood made in his last speech, in his rejoinder last evening, to which I have not had opportunity to reply, to which I feel necessity to do so, and it merits attention. He pointed out, in reply to what I had said, that guaranteed freedom in this life, that we live in this life in a probationary period where we have freedom either to love and serve God or not, to reject him. As Dr. Flood suggested that God should have made man so that he always freely made the right decision. I suggested this was the affirmation of a logical contradiction. But he raised the question, if it is a logical contradiction here on earth for guaranteed freedom or if it involves a logical contradiction for him to say, as he did, that freedom should be guaranteed, or freedom of action to be always right, that it would also be the same in heaven. But now I want to make clear that I have said that guaranteed freedom here on this earth does involve a logical contradiction. But note, please, I have not said what Dr. Flood has assigned to me. You must be very careful to listen to what has been said. It seems clear to me that he misunderstands the whole matter. Let me make clear the truth on the matter. As we go back to the beginning of the scriptural record, Adam's fall was not guaranteed. Adam was a free man, but it was foreknown by God. Now, God can as easily foreknow what will be a free act as he could know what would be an act that was determined. Of a rock falling down a mountain is simply an act of something that has no intelligence. God could foreknow that, and he did, and he foreknew the act of Adam falling into sin. And man's not falling from heaven, that is, once he goes into eternal life, that he will not come out of it, is not guaranteed, certainly not in the sense that man is not free, that he is not one with a free mind in heaven, but that he will not do so is foreknown by God. And so that takes care of Professor Flood's point on that matter. My fellow disputant's point on hell can amount to nothing more than that you, that is Thomas B. Warren, have an incorrect concept of God. That is, that God might exist, but if he did, he could not punish anyone, and Dr. Flood is the one to decide just what concepts God must have. He admitted at one point that it may be the case that matter is not eternal. If so, then since he claims that matter is the only thing that exists, and by implication he holds that at one time nothing exists. But my friends, if at one time nothing exists, nothing would exist today, and so since something does exist, it's clear that he's wrong upon it. He also mentioned miracles, as in the days of Elijah, and said this was a testable situation, but he does not understand the biblical teaching of the Bible, that miracles served a certain purpose of the confirmation of the Word during the days of the New Testament of the apostles and prophets, and that with the completing of the writing of the New Testament scriptures, those miracles have ceased. As to falsifiability, he has admitted that his proposition could be falsified, that the situation which I presented to him would, if it occurred, constitute a falsification of his proposition. He therefore has admitted that it's possible that God does exist, and therefore he's admitted that his proposition is false. He also admitted that the situation which I posed would make clear that my proposition could be verified. He therefore admits that my proposition is possibly true. But thus he's admitted that I may be right and that he may be wrong. For an agnostic, that wouldn't be perhaps so great an admission, but for Dr. Flew, it is indeed a great admission, because an atheist claims that he knows that God does not exist. As to the law of excluded middle, at first Dr. Flew by implication seemed to deny it. Then he admitted it when it was precisely stated propositions, and of course that's all I've ever contended for. But he must remember that the law of excluded middle applies to objects as well as to propositions, so that every object is either human or non-human. Now there's simply no way that Dr. Flew will be able to escape that. Now the law of contradiction, or the law of rationality, means that we should draw conclusions that are warranted, only conclusions that are warranted. I want you to note, as I began the presentation of the first argument that I shall give in the defense of my proposition, in question number 9 of the second night, he admitted the validity of the move from empirical observation in this world to the knowledge of the class of things which is transcendent of the universe. Now it so happens that the class of things which are transcendent of the universe is a class of one member. But Dr. Flew claims that he is able to reason from empirical fact in this world to the state of affairs in that, or as to the number of people in or things in that class of things which are transcendent of the universe. He therefore admits the validity of the move. Now note this very carefully. He admits the validity of the move of reasoning from empirical fact here in the world, which is subject to our observation, to knowledge of things beyond, which are transcendent of the universe. He claims to know by such procedure that this is a null, or as we say in technical terms, an empty class, but he has given absolutely no argument to prove that it's so. Now then, to the actual presentation of the argument. For 2 nights we have been looking for an affirmative argument, and now we have one. I haven't been asking him to climb up a mountain to give us an affirmative argument. I have simply been asking what is ordinarily done in every philosophical paper, and that Professor Flew himself does when he seems to be in different situations here. Here is the argument. It's chart number 41D. If there is even one characteristic, attribute, or property of even one human being which could have come into existence only by the creative power of God, then that one human being constitutes proof that God does exist. Notice I'm talking about one human being. There is something in this world in which I have peculiar insight. I am an empirical fact. I exist, and there are things that I know about myself that nobody else knows. There is at least one characteristic, attribute, or property of at least one human being which could have come into existence only by the creative power of God. Therefore, that one human being constitutes proof, when the evidence is recognized and reasoned about properly, that God does exist. In regard to this argument, I want you to note now on 41E, chart number 41E, the argument is valid. Professor Flew will not question that. Thus, it's clear that if the 2 premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That's what you mean by a valid argument. You mean if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The first premise is quite obviously true. So the only point which can be at issue is the question, is the second premise true? And we now proceed to show that it is. Now let us notice in chart number 41Z. I had intended to have this argument, which is involved in symbols, And though these symbols may seem strange to you, I assure you there is no real problem. I'd intended to have it written out in simply ordinary English words, but I do not have it. But I will read it so that you can understand it just as well. Now, in the first premise, you will notice that we have an argument which involves 9 premises and a conclusion at point number 10. The first premise, where you see C and that little wedge or V-looking thing with the circle around it, means you have strong disjunction, which means it is either one case or the other. Now, the C means that either human beings owe their ultimate origin to creation, or human beings owe their ultimate origin to evolution. Those are the only possibilities, and therefore I've indicated that it's strong disjunction. In the second premise, we have C and a little thing looks like a horseshoe, which is the implication sign. Now, that's read in this way. If human beings owe their ultimate origin to creation, then God exists. This is obvious, since creation can occur only by the hand of God. The third point, E, if E is true, that is, if human beings owe their ultimate origin to evolution, then that evolution must have occurred by one of these 2 ways. Either by some human being being born of some ape or some other non-human thing, or of being transformed from an ape into some other non-human thing into a human being. In other words, you have this situation. In the first case, you have the physical union of 2 apes, and I'll say that without repeating that or some other non-human thing repeatedly. Let's just use ape for sake of illustration. Here are 2 apes in their physical union. The birth is not an ape, but a human being. And the other case is that here is an ape living, already an ape, but he is transformed into a human being. Now, I'm saying if evolution is true, then these are the only possibilities. I give Dr. Flew his task at pointing himself to pointing out some other possibility. Now, in point 4, we note that we falsify. It is false that any human being was ever born of an ape. Dr. Flew has already admitted that no human now living was born of an ape, or that any human that ever lived on the earth was born of an ape. So he's admitted that's no stake at issue. In point 5, we have the point that T is false. That means that no human being has ever been transformed from being an ape. Nothing has ever been an ape living on the earth and then turned into a human being. Dr. Flew has admitted in the questions which he answered that has never occurred with a human being now living, and it has never occurred with any human being that has ever lived in the past. So, by conjunction, we note in point 6, not B and not T. That means that no human being was ever born of an ape, and no human being was ever transformed of an ape. Now, we need to make that move so that we can make the next one, number 7, which by De Morgan's theorem, we have it is false, putting those 2 in proposition, which means that the disjunction of these 2 is false. Now, that simply means it is false to say that human beings owe their origin either to being born of an ape or being transformed from an ape. Now, since we have now falsified the consequent, look back up in point number 3, you have now falsified the consequent of that compound proposition. It then follows in point 8 that you falsify the antecedent. Every proposition which implies a false proposition is false itself. Now, that's what this means. Now, since evolution implies the false propositions that man owes his origin either to being born of an ape or of being transformed from an ape, since that itself is false, then evolution is false. And since evolution is false, going back up to premise number 1, you find that this is strong disjunction. If one of them is false, the other must be true. Since I've shown that evolution is false, then creation must be true. And since we see in the second premise that if creation is true, then God must exist, then therefore I can draw the conclusion from premises 2 and 9 by what we call modus ponens, therefore God does exist. Now, my friends, you have seen an affirmative argument. The argument is valid. All of the premises are true. It is therefore a sound argument. It therefore demands the truthfulness of the conclusion that God does exist. Now, how much time do I have? 1 minute. I wish I had 30 minutes to review for you the questions which have been answered, some of which have not been answered. Out of the 10 tonight, again, we have 3 questions for which there is no answer at all. Dr. Flew is very strong in pointing out in his writings that when men cannot face up to questions, when they must involve themselves in the denial of major undisputed facts, they are involved in a false position. It is therefore clear his failure to answer at least 6 questions in the last 2 nights is indicative that we ought to be rather suspicious of his procedure along this line. But now let us notice, and I'll not have time to go into all of them by any means, but we'll try to before the evening is over, to show you the great significance of the answers which he's given to these questions. Question number 1, answer true or false. It is possible for God to be infinite in some of his attributes and finite in others. For example, he can be infinite in love, but finite in justice, and he answers true. Well, Dr. Flew, you and I are talking about 2 different gods.
Dr. Warren may be assured that I am sobering up from God intoxication and shall be writing considerably less, if anything, in this area in the future, and concentrating largely on social matters, except, of course, for trying to reply to things that people write against the things I've written in the religious area, either to say, no, I don't think they've got it right, or alternatively say, well, yes, I think you have got it right. Second thing, Dr. Warren is also right in observing that I do find it somewhat difficult, in this particular case, to decide whether to say atheist or agnostic. I have tried to give my reasons for deciding, albeit with some difficulty, that it should be atheist rather than agnostic. But it's absolutely right. This is a thing which I've had difficulty with, and I think the situation is, for reasons I've given, one in which there is bound to be some difficulty, though I believe the answer that I have offered at the moment is the right one. Now, 2 more substantial points. 2 substantial points. Let's take the one that came up last first, because that will be the most clearly in people's minds. This business about human and not human. The reason I find difficulty with Dr. Warren's elaborate and certainly valid arguments here is this, that all these arguments take it that human is a precise term. That's to say that in all cases, if you knew all the facts, could see what's going on, you could have no reasonable doubt in saying either definitely human or definitely not human. And making this assumption, Dr. Warren then takes it that an adherent of evolutionary theory makes the same assumption. He then triumphantly draws from a combination of evolutionary theory and this assumption which evolutionary theorists deny, conclusions that are incompatible with that theory. And of course, his argument here is entirely valid. The trouble about it is it does not show that there is a contradiction in the evolutionary theory. It only shows that there is a contradiction between the evolutionary theory and the view of human beings, and in particular the idea that the term human is in this way a precise term. That's to say, there's a contradiction not in evolutionary theory, but a contradiction between evolutionary theory and the view of the nature of the nature of the term human that Dr. Warren and others who deny evolutionary theory all share. So, I won't go into the details of these arguments, which I'm sure are perfectly valid. The trouble with them is simply that they attribute to the evolutionary theorists something that evolutionary theory denies, and then triumphantly derive the conclusion that there is indeed an inconsistency between evolutionary theory and this claim which the evolutionists would deny. The other thing which I would like to take issue with briefly is the matter of freedom and guarantees. Okay, let it be allowed that God could know what free human beings, both in this life and in a life to come, would do and not do, and that this is entirely consistent with their being free human beings. I believe that this is indeed so. But the consequence of this seems to me to be that we've got to say that God created certain creatures, the majority indeed of his creation, as I understand it, in the full knowledge that these would sin and be numbered among the damned. It makes the whole idea of this life as a sort of proving ground rather gratuitous. If you could know, and I agree that you could know if you were God, that this creature would behave in this way and that creature would behave in that way, then there's surely no need to have the proving ground, and above all, no need to have the gigantic wastage involved in these proceedings. Well, I hope that deals with the main points just raised. Let's now go on to something else. It's often suggested that an atheist naturalist cannot explain how the universe came into existence or how it comes to have whatever fundamental characteristics, whatever fundamental laws it may be found in fact to have. The suggestion made then goes on to conclude either that theism, the hypothesis that the universe was made and arranged by God, must be true because it can provide the missing explanations, and that an explanation in these theist terms will, in principle, explain everything. It's also often urged, as if this were as a truism, that science only tells us how, never why. And thereafter, it's usually concluded that there must, in consequence, be, as it were, a vacant slot for a religious system providing explanations of what science cannot explain. Dr. Warren, of course, would want to say, alternatively or additionally, that in the broad but very special case of the origin of species, the scientists have got it wrong, and that the true explanation how, in this particular case, is provided not by evolutionary biology, but by biblical Christianity. I think it might help to get a clearer view of all these matters if I spent a bit of time on some fundamental principles about explanation. My first and very radical point is that we cannot take it as guaranteed that there always is an explanation, much less that there always is an explanation of any particular desired kind. Of course, we usually and rightly believe that there is, and all our past success in the search provides the best possible ground for confidence that there will be, at least in those areas where we have in fact had such success in the past. But there's nothing self-contradictory in the suggestion that there just is not any explanation at all. And still less is there anything contradictory in the suggestion that there just is not any explanation of some particular preferred kind. An explanation is always an answer to a question, and the question to which it is an answer may make an assumption which is not in fact correct. I may come back to this first, rather radical point later, but in any case, it should be more clearly understood and more clearly seen to be true as we go along. Second point, consider this supposed truism: science can only tell us how, never why. Certainly, the word why has here to be construed in a special way. It has to be, for if it's construed as most natural scientists would in their working hours construe it, the supposed truism, science can only tell us how, never why, is not a truism, but a manifest falsism. To avoid that, it has to be construed as referring to an explanation in terms of motives, purposes, and intentions. The intended contrast is between an account of mechanisms and an account of what went on in human or quasi-human terms. An account, that is, referring to the motives, purposes, and intentions of a human or quasi-human agent. But now, if that interpretation is correct, and in fact, I believe it's both sympathetic and correct, then there are two things to be said. One is that it's not true, at any rate it's not true if the human sciences are allowed to rate as sciences, that science can only tell us how and never why. Anthropology, psychology, even psychoanalysis are forever telling us what people are about. Why, in terms of motives, purposes, and intentions, they do some of the queer things that we do. The other, second point, is that to ask for an explanation why, in this interpretation just explained, presupposes that whatever you are asking this question about was in fact done for a reason, and done by some personal or quasi-personal being. You clearly can't insist on getting an explanation of this kind except where this basic assumption applies. Now, this second main point of mine, about the point about science only tells us how, never why, shows in one particular case what I was saying in the first point, namely that to provide an explanation is to answer a question. And it also shows that you can only provide such an answer where the assumption of the question is correct. Now, in the case of the universe as a whole, and any features in the universe which are not the work of men, you can only ask why in this interpretation of why if you are already prepared to assume that it was indeed all the work of some personal or quasi-personal being. What you can't do is what people often do. You can't argue from your insistence that there must be answers to such questions to the conclusion that there is such a being. The third point I want to make about explanation is that it is in principle impossible to explain everything. Suppose that you are thinking of explaining why the paint over the gas cooker goes brown and dirty before the rest of the paint in the same room. Then your explanation of this will be in terms of chemical principles. Something or other in the gas or the gas fumes combines with this or that in the paint. You thus explain what you were asked to explain in terms of chemical regularities which are not themselves at this stage explained. Let's distinguish between the explainers, the elements which do the explaining, and the explained, what is explained. Now, of course, you can go on from this first question to ask for an explanation of those regularities which were the explainers in the first explanation. These explainers are now explained by reference to laws not of chemistry but of physics. And so, in this case, what was previously an element in the explanation now becomes the thing to be explained. Now, the point of this example is that it becomes obvious that however long this sort of chain of explanations can be made, and often it can be made very long indeed, every link in it will leave something which at that stage is not itself explained. So clearly it's impossible for everything in such a series to be explained. Of course, you can, therefore, reasonably fault someone for not pursuing the series of explanations as far as he could or should pursue it. But you can't fault him for ending with principles which are explainers not themselves explained. This same fundamental point obtains even when, at some stage, chains of two different kinds of explanation are linked together. Thus, we may ask why a person does one of those queer things that people sometimes do. And we may eventually reach some conclusion, some adequate explanation of this queer conduct, referring to the fundamental desires, drives, and so on of the person, and no doubt referring to the circumstances in which he did this. But once one's got to these fundamental drives and desires, then, presumably, explanation in terms of motives, purposes, and intention must stop. Just because these are his fundamental desires, there's no further we can go on these lines. But of course, at that point, you can go on to ask a different sort of question. You ask why, in another sense, he has the desires and fundamental drives and whatnot that he does have. And the answer to this will presumably be in terms of physiology, not in terms of motives, purposes, and intentions, but in terms of physiology. Or again, we may, having reached the end of a series of explanation of the facts of the universe by arriving at certain fundamental laws of matter, we may start again to ask why. Suppose now it's the case that there is an answer to such questions at that stage, and that the universe is indeed a divine creation, and that God did have purposes in making it and in subjecting it to the fundamental laws which it has. Okay? Okay. Same principle still holds. Sooner or later, some facts, this time about the existence of God and about God's basic nature, will have to be taken as ultimate, as explainers which cannot themselves be explained. The moral I want to draw from all this is that the theist may reasonably reproach the atheist for failing to explain anything which can and should be explained, a failure which he will account for by reference to the atheist's blindness to the existence and nature of God. But what the theist mustn't do is to chide the atheist for failing to explain everything fully. For in the nature of the case, there must be, in every system of thought, theist as well as atheist, both things explained and ultimate principles which explain but are not themselves explained. In the theist world, these ultimate explainers are, I take it, the brute fact that God does indeed exist and that he does indeed have such and such a nature. In my atheist naturalism, the ultimate explainers of whatever can be explained are the brute fact of the universe itself and the further fact that it is its nature to have these and these fundamental characteristics. Now, what have I been doing all that for, you may ask? I've been doing all that partly because I think it throws a lot of light on the nature of explanation and the sort of questions one can and cannot sensibly ask and sensibly demand an answer for. But I've been doing it mainly in order to try to bring out how things look to an atheist naturalist at the end of the day. He sees the universe as itself ultimate, and its fundamental regularities as being the fundamental principles in terms of which other things can be explained which are not themselves in terms of which other things can be explained, though these fundamental principles cannot themselves be explained. He looks at it, indeed, as presumably the theist looks at things, but the theist sees the fundamental principles which cannot themselves be explained as different principles.